Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Drug Dealer Simulator developers denounce publishers' investigation into Schedule 1 from WindowsCentral.com, posted by Spare Simeon, and they added, the evil that is IP law, it protects publishers' profits while discouraging innovation. And I would agree with that. I personally don't think I personally have always really been against intellectual property law. I would agree there because I think the libertarian position is if a good's tangible like food or like a tool like a smartphone, then you shouldn't be you should be trading it. You should be be entitled to whatever money you want for it. But if a good's intangible, like a fictional character or a gameplay mechanic, then I would argue that the libertarian position there is for anyone should be able to copy whatever they want. If you're a libertarian, you believe in the freedom for everyone to do what they want, and that does include using whatever elements they want to, even if you try and copyright them. I personally, don't think you should just be ripping other people off when it comes to fiction like video games and all that. But if you want to do that, you should be able to. I think intangible things shouldn't inherently be uncopyrightable. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have RFK proposes surveillance of autistic people, video by Molly B. Denham 76 on TikTok from Vladimir Baracris, and that's a cross post from the Aspie Meme subreddit. And yeah, as I said in the last episode, I personally don't really care for the autism registry. If you're a libertarian, you're probably on at least 5 other government registries, though. And then there's the government registries that are everyone's on, including like the census or Social Security. And yeah, I personally don't think there should be any government registries at all. But the government has tons of registries and databases that we know about and don't know about. So this is just another one that they're adding to it. And so I personally don't think there should be an autistic people registry or database. But the government has the legal monopoly on the use of force to justify whatever they feel like, and they've justified tons of other databases like the census, Social Security, or the sex offender registry over the years. So that they can justify whatever they feel like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. So next we have 4-year-old migrant girl, other kids go to court in NYC with no lawyer. The cruelty is apparent. And that's from Gothamist.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally do think, they should be providing lawyers for the underage, like 4-year-olds. But, ultimately, the state can justify whatever it wants to. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, That's I do think children should have as many rights as possible, but sometimes the state is ultimately can determine what rights you can't have, even if you are only 4 years old. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Group Files FCC complaint against ABC, NBC, and CBS for news distortion from TVTechnology.com, but hosted by Ninja Lover. And they added suppress the free press. And I disagree with labeling any of those as the free press. They're the corporate press, which is a big difference. They do have the same free speech as everyone else. They should have the same free speech as everyone else. But they're billionaire funded propaganda machines, just kind of like Reddit is. And I personally think, as I've said in previous episodes, they should be able to say whatever they want to, even if it might be considered slander or libel by those in power. But as I said, the libertarian positions let them fail on their own merits. Increasingly, people are waking up to the fact that they're nothing more than mere propaganda machines for the Democratic Party. So, and people are increasingly tuning them out. So, I do think that's the libertarian position is, that they're propaganda outlets, but that doesn't mean the state should be going after them, I do think, if a private group wants to go after them, I think it seems to be like a private group going after them, they should be able to, but I don't think the state should be going after them. I think the libertarian position is, as I've said countless times, let them fail on their own merits, and if you want to listen to them, that's fine, but they're entitled to the same amount of public trust that InfoWars is. Zero. No news source is entitled to any public trust whatsoever, and the legacy corporate media need to stop acting like they are, if you ask me. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Hexif orders makeup studio installed at Pentagon from CBSNews.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the military subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't think that's kind of a waste of taxpayer money, but as I've said, the government is in the position to justify whatever force it wants to. So if they want to justify having a makeup studio at the Pentagon, they have the monopoly on legal force to justify that. The Pentagon's already a government building. If it were up to me, we wouldn't have a Pentagon in the first place. We wouldn't have, I would say, we wouldn't have a centralized military. We would have decentralized militia groups instead. And that's what I think the libertarian position is in regards to the military. I personally, when it comes to a lot of presidential elections, I do vote for whoever the highest person in the military is. When it came to when I did the exercise of vote of every past presidential election, going through it, but I think that's because the military is in a lot of ways the ultimate exercise of the government's monopoly on legal use of force. And yeah, I personally, but as I said, the libertarian position is, we shouldn't be having a centralized military. We should have a decentralized militia groups instead. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have White House seeks to change Civil Rights Act from whitehouse.gov, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's a cross post from the law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for the Civil Rights Act. And if the White House wants to justify changing it, they should be able to. I personally think, a lot of what are marketed as civil rights are just more a government excuse for authoritarianism. I do think people should have the same rights regardless of their race, gender, etc., etc. But, people shouldn't be forced to give others the same rights if they don't feel like it. I would say that our rights are innate. They come from within. The government shouldn't be telling us what our rights are. I don't think we should even be having government civil rights acts because the government shouldn't be telling us what our rights are in the first place. So that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have Texas creates its own Doge in an attempt to make the state more business friendly from KiraNews.org, and that's a post from Donald Key. And yeah, I personally think that's a good idea. If they want to do that, that sounds like a good idea. Reddit always shits on whatever a Republican state like Texas does, but I do think that's a good idea. Then next we have Trump pardons Nevada politician who paid for cosmetic surgery of funds to honor a slain officer from APnews.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, ultimately I think the president has too much pardon power, and this is a good example of that. But as the way things are currently, sometimes the president might pardon someone who you don't like, and there's nothing you can do about it. I didn't care when Joe Biden pardoned his son or Dr. Fauci, but he had the government state monopoly on the use of force then, and now it's the orange man who has it. So ultimately, the president can justify whoever it wants to, whatever he wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have FBI arrests Wisconsin judge on charges of obstructing immigrant arrest from WashingtonPost.com. It was by Ninja Lover, and they added, "Here we go." And yeah, I personally don't think the FBI should be arresting judges, but ultimately they have the monopoly of force justify wherever they feel like. I don't really care for the legal system as a whole, but I don't really care for the FBI either. So if they want to fight each other, that's on them. I personally don't think it doesn't matter too much though. People are always saying, "Oh, this is the biggest thing ever," but nothing ever really seems to happen, and that just goes to show you, we live in a world where seemingly anything can happen, but nothing ever really does. And Reddit and the media and the legacy media are good examples of that. They're always constantly fear-mongering about how the world's ending, but in reality, nothing ever really happens. Next, we have a developing political scandal in Florida has Governor Ron DeSantis on the defensive from NPR.org, and that's from Flimsy Al 5563. And they had it looks as though $10 million worth of state-owned money was used as dark money contributions. And yeah, Reddit's been kind of quiet about Ron DeSantis recently. In 2022, they thought he was the worst thing ever, but now that he's in the background compared to the Trump administration, suddenly, you don't see as many headlines about him anymore. But regardless, I think it's interesting how Reddit only seems to care about government corruption when it's the Republicans doing it. There's probably tons of examples of Democrat corruption as well, but Reddit doesn't care because, it's all in-group good, out-group bad. And when they do care, when they do bring up an example of Democrat corruption like Bob Menendez, they are only doing it because he's seen his liability. And yeah, they'll never criticize any of their own as long as unless they're thrown into the liability pile, in which case they're suddenly completely free to criticize whoever they want, like Bob Menendez was. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.